You are with the American Enterprise Institute, and you're a political economist, and you seem to focus a great deal on population demographics, economic development. And I recently read your article in the Foreign Policy, and it was called The Age of Depopulation. Very foreboding sounding, but I'm going to try to put a smile to it. I'm not going to take it as a complete negative. So I'd like to understand first and foremost the global trends as you laid them out, and then I want to focus in on the United States.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me. The global trends are quite astonishing because we're entering into absolutely uncharted territory. We're heading towards a peaking and an indefinite decline in human numbers. Now, we've just lived through a population explosion unlike any growth in human numbers in previous times ever recorded. In the year 1900, there might have been 1.5 billion people on Earth. Today, there are over 8 billion. So obviously, nothing of that scale ever happened before. We've had depopulations. We've had global depopulations in the past. The last one was in the 1300s. It was caused by the bubonic plague, by the Black Death. And as that episode might suggest, when we've had depopulations in the past, it's been due to catastrophes. It's been due to mortality explosions from famine or disease, or
War.
But now we're more prosperous than we've ever been, better educated than we've ever been as a species, and more healthy than we've ever been. And we're heading towards a depopulation because people are choosing to have smaller and smaller families. And they're now choosing childbearing patterns which are not high enough to keep population stability. I mean, just let me give you a couple of examples of how unbelievably fast things have changed. Then we'll get to the United States. Mexico. Last year, the birth level in Mexico City was less than 1 baby per woman per
Crazy.
Now, obviously, you need a little bit more than 2 children per woman per lifetime to keep long-term population stability. For the first time since we started keeping numbers, Mexico's fertility level was lower than that of the United States. Give you another example. The city of Kolkata in India, which I first visited about 50 years ago. It was teeming with children. Kolkata now, according to local officials, has a fertility level of about, again, 1 baby per woman per lifetime. This is an unimaginable change. And it's happening really fast in a lot of different places in the world. In East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, even in a lot of the Muslim expanse, this is happening. We're at a point now where maybe 3/4 of the world's people live in countries that don't have childbearing patterns high enough to maintain population stability or achieve
Growth.
population growth. So it's just we're heading towards, we're passing the global threshold for sub-replacement fertility, and then it'll just be a little time after that, since we're not having extraterrestrials come to inhabit Earth.
I agree.
It'll be just a little bit of time after that until the global labor force peaks in size, and then total world numbers peak after that. So we're a bit of an exception here in the United States. because we have sub-replacement fertility levels, but for a rich country, our fertility levels, is a little bit higher than most. And we've also had a history of absorbing immigrants, of absorbing newcomers from all over the world. And we've had a great record of turning newcomers into loyal and productive Americans. Other places haven't been as good at assimilating as we have.
That's
So,
very true.
but, so, so our prospects are somewhat different from this global prospect, at least for a while. And as long as we have the secret sauce of being able to bring in newcomers and convert them into Americans, we've got a sort of an advantage that most other places don't have. But even in the long run, I think we ought to get used to the idea that the United States may also join in this depopulation that I'm describing for the world as a whole.
Well, let me go back to the world before we get to the United States. Find all this so fascinating. I actually told my booker, I said, I want to talk to somebody about population. Find me the best guy. And that apparently is you, Nick.
I don't know if the best guy would agree, but thank you.
So tell me the numbers, the percentage in East Asia. I read that and I was really shocked.
Well, we have two big areas of the world where the head count has already started to decline. One is Europe, if you include Russia in Europe, which I think the Russians probably would, and maybe the Europeans would as well. And the other is East Asia, which of course is dominated by China, because China is about 5/6 of all of the East Asian population. In East Asia, the overall fertility level is almost 50% below what would be needed for population stability. I mean, it's a shockingly low birth rate for a non-catastrophic situation. And China's fertility level now, according to their numbers, is about 50% below what would be needed for stability. And there are places that are even lower than China.
Isn't South Korea about 65% below?
You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
Crazy.
South Korea's birth level is at this point about 0.7 births per woman per lifetime if current patterns were continued over lifetime. And you do the arithmetic on keep that up for 3 generations, and the great-grandchildren's cohort would have 5 girls for every 100 great-grandmothers today.
Wow.
It's unimaginable. It's just really unimaginable. So I'm not at all sure it's going to keep up, if you see what I mean, but it's an astonishing thing to happen outside of war, outside of pestilence, outside of asteroid strike. And all of this is being driven by voluntary decisions that parents or would-be parents are making.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that because choice, I think we need to talk about choice and the will of the people versus government intervention and, demographic engineering and all that. Because I think that, at least in our country, we should have perhaps a conversation as to, whether our choice as individuals and families is wiser, or at least it's our right to choose population policies, and when it comes to obviously the personal level, but also as a society overall, or whether the government engineers sit back with their calculators and diagrams and decide this is the policy we need to put in to achieve our nirvana type end. And so let's get back to that. What's happening in Africa? Well, Africa's a big place. I understand.
Yeah, well, Africa is a plenty big place, well over 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa alone. It's the last remaining bastion of any appreciable size of above replacement childbearing. Maybe 75% above the replacement level, Africa. But even Africa is seeing this mark towards lower fertility and now towards sub-replacement fertility in some places. Some of the offshore islands like Mauritius are already below replacement. That's tiny compared to Africa, but at least it's an existence proof that something can go on in space. South Africa is just about at replacement, and it's been heading down rapidly. I think we can probably expect to see South Africa emerge as the first big below replacement society in the subcontinent. It'll be followed by some of the other southern African countries, and even in Central Africa, East Africa, West Africa, you're seeing what otherwise would be regarded as big drops in birth rates. Birth rates are still very high, but they've come down 35, maybe 40% over the last generation and a half. So every place on Earth is going in the same direction. There are no big counterexamples over the past two generations. There's a fascinating trend in Israel.
That's what I wanted to get to next.
Israel is the most fascinating exception to fertility in our modernity, because you've seen an actual increase in Jewish fertility in Israel since the mid-1990s. And of course, we don't know how long this will continue, where it's going to go. But Israel is at the moment the lone exception among affluent societies to this march below replacement. There's a long period in the U.S. was the fascinating exception. From about the early 1980s until the financial crisis of 2008 until Obama's election, the United States was at or just slightly above replacement. We were a huge, fascinating exception. But over the past decade and a half, America has also joined the sub-replacement club.
I predict, based on nothing other than just my gut, so that and $4 will get you a cup of coffee. But, well, firstly, do you agree that trends come and then go, that they reverse, and then they turn back again? There's fluctuations, there's equilibrium. Maybe you have a massive growth in anything, in industry, whatever you're looking at, and then you have a reversal or a stasis that occurs, and then maybe there's another growth. Can't we look at this as, well, firstly, we don't know what's necessarily causing it, because past predictions and forecasts have been wrong, I would say. For instance, when I was in school, we were taught that the world was going to face a catastrophic global freezing. We were also taught that overpopulation was a ticking time bomb and that it was going to lead to a dystopian future of worldwide starvation and death. I remember that very clearly in my science classes. So in that case, overpopulation, bad. What is the solution? The governments, global entities like the UN have to race into policies of engineering, trying to stem the tide of this Malthusian overpopulation. But then, conversely, we have the America, when we focus down on America, we have been told that our decline in birth rates and graying population cannot sustain our government safety net policies that were put in by government, like Social Security and Medicare. So underpopulation is bad. Solution, government intervention and demographic engineering by mass immigration or whatever else. So which is it? Is growing exponentially, forever going up in population, good or bad? And is it different for America?
Well, such important questions. Start at the beginning. There's been a lot of arrogance and overconfidence by so-called demographic experts about their ability to forecast trends accurately and about their ability to fine-tune through, as you were calling it, through engineering, so-called optimal population trends for any economy or country or society. You know, there's a huge amount of irrational scaremongering during the period of the population explosion, and really a lot of ideology masquerading as science. One of the most obvious things in retrospect is how wrong-headed the assessment of the consequences of population growth were. I mean, the real driver of the big explosion in post-war global population wasn't birth rates. We weren't suddenly starting to breed like rabbits. It's that we finally stopped dying like flies.
Exactly.
We had this health explosion. And if you're going to have a population problem, I'll take a health explosion any day of the week, right? I mean, you may translate it into all of its possible beneficial potential, but it's there for you to have. And so instead of the Paul Ehrlich mass famine and the resource scarcity of the Club of Rome and all of these failed threat warnings, we find ourselves as a species richer than we've ever been, healthier than we've ever been, better fed than we've ever been, better educated than we've ever been, with more technological opportunities than we've ever had before, right? So there are more of us than ever before, and from at least a material standpoint, we're better off than we ever were before. So they got those big things very now, as to future population trends, we still don't know how to forecast birth. Right? I mean, everything depends upon how many babies are born when you're doing the long-term projections, and we don't have an accurate method for it. It gets to the other point you were. The best predictor that I can see for fertility, interestingly enough, is the number of babies people say they want. Is that interesting? Desired fertility is income is better than education, is better than contraception, is better than urbanization.
So people know what they want, and but we should trust them.
Isn't that funny? We're not rabbits. We're not robots. This human agency does kind of matter, right? But there's no way of predicting how that human agency, how those preferences are going to unfold in the decades immediately ahead, because human beings are very complicated creatures, and they have this volition thing going. What I can say is, so far, we haven't seen any society that's dipped way below replacement, even temporarily, let's say like 35% below replacement. We haven't seen them come back up to the replacement level, even briefly. That hasn't happened yet. Doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. We
Right.
haven't yet. And so what we're seeing at the moment is countries all over the world at different levels of education, at different levels of income, different levels of poverty, all marching almost together down below the replacement level. And so now we're seeing things that even 10 years ago, people who followed this stuff wouldn't have believed. So, for instance, one of the poorest countries on earth is Burma, is Myanmar.
Hmm.
Um, the United Nations has a designation for the very poorest countries. They call them the least developed countries, the fragile states with lots of pretty limited education. Burma is one of those countries, and it is also a below replacement fertility country. So it's not just the rich countries anymore that have lower levels of fertility and smaller family size. This has spread through all of the world. And the threshold for entering into below replacement fertility in terms of education, in terms of income, in terms of poverty level, well, in terms of education and income, it's lower than it's ever been before. And in terms of poverty rates, it's probably higher than it's ever been before. So we don't see this, we don't see the materialistic,
Right. It's not,
determining.
well, the world is not based just on material factors. Those are not the only drivers in how we choose um, to make decisions or what we choose in our lives. And also, I mean, think about all the multiplicity of factors that come into every practically every decision in our lives. And there are so many outside forces that may trump what we choose or desire in our hearts, or what logic doesn't always have anything to do with it. It's just maybe our will. But if you have a government that is that is oppressive, or you
Mhm.
have a government that encourages human flourishing, but you might have wars that one government doesn't want and the other government does, and there's so many mixes of factors, and then just invention and entrepreneurship and maybe even the spiritual well, not maybe even, I would say the spiritual even comes into this in the sense that people have to interpret what's happening in the world, and hope or despair can
Uh-huh.
have a great deal to do with our choices.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean,
I
there's
think you put your finger on something, because the metaphysical, the spiritual, um, the non-material hopes, desires, and fears uh, really come to the fore when you're looking at these trends. I mean, one of the differences between the United States and, let's say, Europe in terms of fertility um, is not obviously the economic, right? I mean, Europe Europe may not be as affluent as the U.S., but it's pretty rich, certainly by
Mhm.
any standpoint. Where you see the real gap between Europe and the U.S. is in the world of values and aspirations. I mean, three of the uh, three of the big differences that you can track with opinion polls and those sorts of things between Europe and the U.S. have to do with confidence in the future, with religiosity, patriotism. I mean, they're not all separate. I think they're kind of overlap, kind of
I'm so
bundled.
excited. Let me just pause and just affirm something here. As I'm reading all of your different articles and, getting to know you before I got to know you, I thought, I would hope we can go down this route that we're starting on right now. But I have no idea if that's even going to be something that he would have processed before. And I think it's so intuitively obvious
Yeah.
from an American. I'm a Christian. I have American values and perspective and Christian values and perspective or Judeo-Christian philosophy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so you're actually seeing it yourself. Do most economists or demographers even e- you know bring that in as a component of their prophesying?
Well, I mean, there are people who just stick with the numbers. There are people who are a little bit uncomfortable about this. Some of the questions of values get kind of trained out of you if you take certain types of economic courses. I mean, uh, economics is great in helping you understand about the family in some ways, but what we're just talking about is considered exogenous taste. And
Ooh.
exogenous tastes are outside of the realm of analysis. You know, so,
I,
oops.
I've
Wait,
heard that word, but I'm going to use it from now on.
yeah,
Exogenous days.
yeah.
So let's
So,
go back to those exogenous
yeah, the
days.
exogenous tastes, which are kind of interesting, aren't they?
Yeah, let's
Yeah,
talk about it.
yeah. So, um, if you if you compare the United States and Europe, as I did some years ago, may not be perfectly the same now, but it's basically similar. Um, People who say they are secular in the U.S. and in Europe have about the same number of kids. People who say they are religious or that religion is meaningful in their lives have about the same number of kids in Europe and in the U.S. Um, what's different between Europe and the U.S. is that there's a much, much larger number of people, much larger share of people who say that religion matters in their lives than in Europe today. And that
Yeah.
really helps to explain the gap. Um, it doesn't, I don't think it's a huge shock or, kind of like a Christopher Columbus aha moment to say that people for whom religion matters more are going to be more open to children, are going to be more confident about the future, the Lord helping to provide, that
Hmm.
the life, all of those things I think are pretty consonant, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, with religiosity. So I wouldn't say that that's a surprise of any sort. And we may even see it in the Muslim expanse as well. I mean, there are some people who say that you include Islam with Christianity and Judaism and Abrahamic tradition. You can argue about that. But I'll
Yeah.
tell you a thing that's fascinating. For example, in Iran today,
Mm.
despite the
So interesting.
religious dictatorship, despite the clerisy, um, the number of births per woman is, I think, a little bit lower than in the U.S. today. It's
Mm.
the fertility level is far below replacement. In Tehran, the birth level is kind of like Zurich. It's kind of like a very low, very sub-replacement European sort of fertility level. And I don't think, I don't think that an Islamist country where Islam is front and center to the meaning of life would see persistent, substantial below replacement fertility for the population as a whole. I see that paradox. I interpret that paradox, whether I'm correct or not, another thing, but I interpret that paradox as telling us that beneath the clerical dictatorship lies a basically secular Iranian population. And what that suggests to me is you could have something change real fast. in Iran from a political stand.
Well,
How? What?
the
But
numbers I've seen are that there might be as low as 40% Muslims actually in Iran now. And I have also noticed overwhelmingly that when Muslims first, as they would say, apostatize,
yeah,
they it seems to me that many of them go to it's on a journey to immediately to atheism of some
mhm,
sort, and then
mhm,
they start, okay, I'm out. I'm an atheist, and then they start moving toward exploration of other options. And I
but
also heard that there's an explosion of Christian. Talking about motivations, couldn't it be that so you have two societies and one is declining for one reason in population or fertility, and
yep,
another for another reason,
yep,
and you really can't discern it because, for instance, when you were talking about Iran, which I hadn't been thinking about, I thought, it might be their, I'm putting it to the man kind of a thing too,
mhm,
a little bit, because the Iranian people, the Persians, do not like their government and they want it to, the theocracy that they have there to end.
yeah,
So maybe in that circumstance, it
mhm.
also makes a difference. I don't know.
No, could be. It could be. I mean, my guess, since I don't have uh, the actual information at hand to help me explain that, my guess is you may have a whole lot of different stories in a whole lot of different countries. Uh, and it would be good if we had kind of like reporters worth their salt in the world these
Mm,
days. The
good
answer
idea.
have reporters talk to human beings and ask them, well,
Because the world is
get that.
not a homogeneous. I mean, we know how diverse, well, every single culture, nation, society is drastically different than the one next to it. Even though they
Sure,
might seem on a map to look familiar, they really
sure.
are not.
And so, but if you've got this going on in Thailand and in Nepal and in Iran and now in South Africa, maybe, and in almost all of South America, those are very different places and they're very
Yes.
different religions, very different traditions, cultures, histories, languages. So it would be nice to know a lot more about that. I'll mention one other thing about the Muslim world. Um, Iran's not the only country that's Muslim majority that's below replacement. Turkey is another obvious one. Lebanon's another one. Bangladesh is about to head below replacement. Indonesia as well. So this is happening all over the Ummah, all over the global community of Islam as well. I was in Turkey last year, and it's fascinating to see how things had changed there. In Istanbul, where I was, the birth level was about 1.2 births per woman per lifetime. So in Turkey, it was lower than in Europe,
That's crazy.
or in parts of Turkey at least. I mean, but Turkey as a whole is about the same as the EU, Europe, and that's even including the Kurdish portion of Turkey. If you just took the Turkish ethnics, they'd probably be below the European fertility rate right now. Who'd have thought that?
Who'd have thought? Who'd have thunk it? And when I've looked at the Israeli fertility rate, because obviously in Israel, fertility, I mean, people don't much care about, a lot of countries what their fertility rate is. Like, why would I really care about that? It might be the thought. But in Israel, uh, population has outstanding import, and the the Arab Palestinians have a declining birth rate,
Right.
and the Israelis. And by the way, one note, you probably know this, but it's not just about the highly religious, more
You're absolutely right.
orthodox. It
Absolutely
is
right.
educated. It is high net worth or prosperous, middle
Yep.
class and above women that are
Yep.
procreating
Yep.
and building families. And And this whole conversation, when I look askance at the whole idea that, we're in this catastrophic downturn, because it's not that I'm for not having families and not having 3 or 4 kids of family. That is not my ethic. It's more that I just think that trends are trends. They come and go, and maybe we're moving into something like a stabilizing time frame. I mean, period. If you look at a company, do you want the company's number of workers to grow continuously? Where does that ever end? Should a company, like, we're looked at as a workforce in
Yep.
America sometimes, and I think that's a little dehumanizing. But if you're going to use that analogy, and basically make policy depending upon whether our workforce is large enough, um, if you have a company that continues to grow in its workforce, that's not always the best company, the most prosperous company. Maybe sometimes doing a Twitter X thing where you fire 90% of them makes the company in the long term grow or be more prosperous and have flourishing or, technological growth and prosperity or profitability, I guess. What do you think about that?
I think you put your finger on it with the word flourish, because you want every human being to have the potential to flourish. And the head count doesn't matter so much if the individual human beings are flourishing. And I believe, I'm quite confident actually, that it's possible for a society to maintain and increase its prosperity, even if it's shrinking and aging, because look at what we've got going. We've basically already figured out how to crack the material poverty problem. We've almost ended material absolute poverty in most of the world now. We've got the formula for it. If you have the right business environment, you can do it. I mean, if you don't have a killer government and a dirigist dictatorship, you can do it. And what that also means is that even if a society is shrinking in size, as long as you're a bit flexible and open to capturing opportunities and avoiding risks, with an increasingly healthy population, with an increasingly educated population, with a free market, with innovation and entrepreneurship and knowledge creation, um, you're not going to be doomed.
I
If
love
you,
that description that you just gave.
yeah, but
All of those things, if and I think that a lot of Americans, those who are watching and see this would say, well, I feel like all of those things are in our grasp or we have that potentiality in America. Look, I think many, many people are very, very happy about what happened November 5th and January 20th and see that at least we're on the right track for making perhaps some big changes in how we do things. And yeah,
we'll need to do that because I
yeah,
mean it's like if the wrong-headed way of looking at this, it seems to me, is kind of like the wrong-headed way of looking at the population explosion in the old days. It's like saying, "OMG, OMG, we have a picnic and we're at low tide and we're all going to drown." It's like, move,
just move the picnic over.
move,
Go up.
yeah, right? And so as long as we are kind of open-minded and flexible and kind of deliberate about seizing opportunities, there's all sorts of scope for improvement and advancement, even if the head count isn't growing. I mean, it's got to be a sort of a individual focus, individual liberty, individual opportunity, individual prosperity sort of focus, rather than thinking that you're going to be able to kind of engineer the birth rate so that you're going to kind of fine tune things to make some sort of
Yeah, the fine tuning.
conceit. That's just a
Yeah, it
fatal.
is hubris.
Yeah.
I was interested when I was reading. It never really occurred to me that that there's a simple thing we should keep in mind when it comes to population growth and fertility rates. That fertility rates have to be higher in certain nations or countries than in others because say you have 2.1%
Hmm.
fertility per woman in America, right? We
Hmm.
don't have a lot of wars. I mean, our crime
But
rate is can be bad in many cities, but generally, um, 2.1%, we would be replacing our population
mhm,
and accounting for some deaths,
mhm,
some early deaths. But
yeah.
in another nation, maybe a nation that's constantly doing genocides or getting involved in wars,
Mhm.
or we remember China and um, all of the Soviet Union's
Yeah.
things, and if they're doing that, obviously you have to produce more children to replace the ones you're slaughtering, right? So
Mhm.
3.5 or 3.6 you might
Mhm.
have there in a nation for a replacement level, and I never really quite thought of it that way.
Sure. Well, I mean, we live now as a planet at the healthiest point that the species has ever seen, and so for the world as a whole, uh, life expectancy we think is about 73 years. I mean, that's higher than the U.S. life expectancy was after World War II.
Hmm.
So this terrible scourge of mass mortality that was the lot, the accepted fate of human being for basically most of our existence has been lifted from almost all parts of the world. There's still some very, very poor areas where life expectancy is much lower than we'd like it to be. But this explosion of health all over the world is creating, you know, it's a great blessing. It's creating benefits for parents and for their children, and for their families and friend communities, and also for those societies.
Yes, the
It's
whole societies.
very
You know,
positive.
um, I'll go back to this idea of um, engineering by
Like,
policies, and let's focus on this. At one point, we decided, or the government decided, that we were going to have a social security system,
really?
and then I don't remember the year for Medicare. And so these are these safety nets.
Yeah.
And when I looked at the numbers, um, I think Social Security is over $1 trillion a year, um, and the same is true for Medicare.
Mhm.
And whether that was the right decision or not, whether it would be better if we, you know, I guess, attempt to extricate ourselves from that kind of a social net in our society, what I have seen is that we create this, but we don't pay for it as we go, and we don't
Right.
invest funds. Well, we steal the
Right.
funds. The government steals the funds, but we also don't invest it like most people do. Is this is my understanding
Right.
into growth industries and get a return on the investment and build up, like a retirement fund would be built up. So we have this money that we're stealing. We have this money that is
Right.
not growing. And then we also it's set up so that the future generation has to ultimately pay for it, or there has to be debt. So we go into massive debt. So, um, and so
Right.
if the future generation has to pay for it in whatever manner, taxes, inflation, and all that, then they have to keep growing. If the population is stagnant, then there's not enough of
Right.
the next generation to pay for the previous generation.
Right.
So then we have the men and women in the Senate and the president, and whomever, saying, we have to have an increase in our population. This is a big problem
Mhm.
because we have to be able to pay for these government programs that we put in place without thinking about the ultimate um, uh, object or end of that could lead us to. So then we take that and we say, well, but we're not producing enough in the next generation. So now we need to insert another government program, and it is mass immigration. And by the way, we're not going to chat with you about that. We're not going to really get a sense of the will of the governed and ask them, what do they want? For instance, if we had a questionnaire survey of some sort, we might be surprised by the answers. If somebody said, do you want an ever increasing population growth in America? And I think people would say, well, is that inevitable? Do I have to have that? If it was at stake. Now, if you do want an ever increasing population for whatever reason, do you want to solve that or engineer that by mass immigration every year? And then the person says, maybe. Maybe I want to change my answer to the first one. What I'm saying is, I don't think we're talking about this in real terms, on honest terms, and the will of the people are not involved here.
Well, so if we hold the government programs as constant and inviolate, and we have to take population as the variable quantity, we're looking at everything upside down, right? I mean, the reason that we've got this pay-as-you-go contrivance where current workers are financing the retirement of current retirees is because that looked like a great way to kind of cut financial corners when our society was like an old-fashioned population pyramid, when working-age people were relatively plentiful and retirement-age people were relatively scarce, when we were a youthful society. Okay, but we're heading towards being a graying society, and the number of working-age people for relationship to the number of retirement-age people is changing very unforgivingly. That's what happens with an aging society. And so the pay-as-you-go system that looked so great when birth rates were high and there weren't many old people comes back to bite. And so, to me, the answer isn't to hold the entitlement structure, constant and sacred. It's to figure out what worked best for the people of America. And this is also true of other countries that are graying and are actually much further down the road than we are. I would think that the way to look at this is to shift from a system where the current workers are paying for the current retirees to a system where everybody eventually kind of gets ready to finance their own retirement, they're more self-reliant. It's a lot more complicated than just
exactly.
Have to make sure there's provision for people who suffer misfortunes, and then you want to make sure that people don't end up in extreme poverty. And it's also somebody takes a hit when you go from the current system to the new system, and you've got to figure out how you end up compensating people who are going to take a hit so there can be consensus for actually moving to something that's going to work better. But if you don't do that, then exactly as you say, the only remedies are going to be extra layers of entitlement and extra layers of government intervention to kind of tweak the existing dysfunction that the government's caused in the first place.
Well, I don't know, since you're not on X, quite shockingly, you may have seen a little less in this than I did and others, that this H-1B brouhaha or kerfuffle, not sure which one it is, exploded right after Christmas. Maybe it was December 26th or 27th, this conversation about the H-1B visa. And and we barely even started the conversation about the other visas in our complex of visa systems. And I think that in the last election, it was very, very clear that immigration is something that the American people want to have a voice in. And I think that that's just a matter of a democratic republic,
Sure.
that we ought to have a voice in it.
Sure.
Um, it's it would be like my husband coming home with 7 children and saying, "Honey, we just adopted 7 kids. Honey, do you think we could have talked about it? And now it's too late," right? Um, that's just not something that I think is very American or patriotic. Now, with the visa system, it's so complex and it's being abused to the point where you would call it legitimate corruption. There's a lot of illegality going on. And I think that the American people, the more that this is exposed, are going to want to make changes. And my goal is to understand, you know, if there is some kind of way that in America, if Americans choose to have 1.9 children, or on average 2.2, right? So it's just shy of replacement level. Do we end up, and by the way, I'm not talking yet about, innovation and
Yeah.
this idea that we're bringing from India and China smarter, more skilled,
Mhm.
and dedicated, employees that we have in America. So, to heck with them. I'm not talking about that. But just as far as a population growth, um, what if we just stayed at 340 million? What if we, and say, let's take out Social Security right now,
Yep.
these artificial interventions, take out the $2+ trillion in entitlements, and say we just stayed at 340 million, but we just had smart people and a great economy. And what would be the harm in that? Is there a disaster there?
No, I don't think there's a disaster at all in that. I think we'd need to change our standard operating procedure in some pretty important ways that we probably ought to do I wrote
Like
a
what?
piece. Well, I'll give you some examples. We probably should learn to live within our means in
Ooh,
terms of our budget, in terms of our national budget, and not basically borrow from our children and unborn grandchildren to support current entitlement spending, which is exactly what we're doing.
yeah.
We probably ought to figure out some sort of way that we get the 7 million uh, prime working age guys who are neither working nor looking for work at the moment back into the game. I mean, that's a big,
It's a
serious
big,
thing, and it's a huge problem for America. It's a moral problem as well as an
it
economic,
is.
social problem, and it's part of the reason that families are so fragile today is because you've got people who should be providers who are being provided for, right?
Mm.
Uh, you go through all of the list like this, and I could go on for a while about it.
You
Tip,
started to mention, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have
yeah,
interrupted you, but you
yeah,
started to mention an article that you wrote. Is that
yeah.
related to this? Because I want you to tell us what the name of the
Yeah,
article
sure.
is.
I wrote a couple of books, a couple of editions of a book called Men Without Work,
Mhm.
America's Visible Crisis, uh, which made point that for every uh, primate 25 to 54-year-old guy who's unemployed, there are 3 or today 4 guys who are neither working nor looking for work. And you don't see them because the unemployment rate doesn't measure. If you looked at the proportion of working age guys who aren't drawing a paycheck, we're basically at kind of 1940, 1939 levels.
Mm.
We're so prosperous that we can afford to maintain this dysfunction. A less rich country couldn't have this level of dysfunction. But so back to the uh, immigration question. No, I don't think that a government could have devised a much more brilliant way to poison American support for immigration than the Biden administration did with this lawless crisis on the southern border. I mean, illegal, lawless, unfair, dangerous. I mean, go through the adjective.
Mhm.
And I mean, no country can be a sovereign country unless it controls its own borders, right? I mean, there is no such
Right.
sovereign country unless you control who is in your country and is not in your country. Now, so I don't think there is room in the argument for a debate about illegal immigration, right? I mean, I think that's legal immigration is something that we can have a big discussion about, but we shouldn't be having a discussion about the level of tolerance we have for illegal immigration. I will say that at this point in time, right, the United States has a higher share of people born abroad than we've ever had before. We've got a
Mm.
higher share of people in our country who were born in other countries than during the 1890s. I mean, then during the
That's
big,
crazy. Because isn't it about 15% almost?
yeah, it may be over 15% now, I mean, higher than we've ever recorded before. So one of the things this means is that the U.S. economy at the moment is more dependent on foreign-born labor than it's ever been before in history. And we- I did the numbers on this last year, and something like well over 20% of the work in the United States today is done by people who weren't born in the U.S. I mean, there's a huge demand for work that our native-born Americans are not filling, and it's we'd want to get, and for other reasons, we'd want to get the guys off of the couch. But
Right.
even if we got all of the guys off of the couch, that isn't going to take care of this great big gap. So we need to
Well,
figure out what's for us best.
yeah. If we're spearheading a huge project now on looking at all these numbers and dissecting every single immigration program, because I think it's singularly important to our future. And what we're finding is that in the STEM area, for instance, science, technology, engineering, and math, that of the 35% of students that go on to study in these programs, that something along the line of only 17% of them actually end up being employed in the STEM fields. And what it seems to be happening is because in 1989, when they were developing the argument for the H-1B that led to the Immigration and Citizenship Act of 1990, um, that the National Science Academy of Science came out with a study, but in their memos, they said, we're doing this so that master's degree program PhDs, when they graduate, we can import foreigners. This was their memos, right? To suppress or keep down what we have to pay these graduates, the Americans, right? So we keep it down. And what we've seen is this flattening of maybe real wages, not real wages, maybe wages look like they're going up a little bit, but it's really flattened. But what's also happening is that if you can get 100,000 or 200,000 or a million low wage Indian or Chinese or, from anywhere else, but it's mostly India and China, obviously, um, then that suppresses the wages for Americans. But then it systematically gets to the point where they're not even attempting to hire Americans, and that's what we have found. They're not attempting to hire Americans. That one woman I heard about sent out 3,000 resumes and never was. And other stories I'm hearing is 200-300 resumes, and these are engineering graduates in the tech field. So we are looking at all of that and trying to expose it. But if we got those guys that are on the couch, like, why are they on the couch? Is it because they're not finding the kind of education? Is there demoralization? What do you think?
Well, there surely is huge demoralization. But from what I was able to learn, only a very, very small fraction of them say that they're on the couch because they couldn't find a job. It's not because of the scarcity of work, it's for other reasons.
Really?
I don't think this is a case where, in any appreciable degree, people are on the couch because somebody born in another country is taking a job that they would have had. I think there's other reasons for this. And with the whole question of immigration,
Yeah.
yes, I'd also say my own feeling is we ought to keep our eyes on the prize. I mean, I think we're a lot better off for having Elon Musk in this country than if he's still off in South Africa. I think we've got,
Agreed.
just go through the alphabets from Meta, or to Apple. Steve Jobs' father was Syrian.
Oh, we're not against immigration. I'm not against immigration.
Huge amount of talent and value that we're a magnet for talent from all over the world, and want to figure out how to capitalize upon that too.
I agree with that. I really do. I think an overhaul of the system where we actually are bringing in those people, but that's not mass migration though, is it? Because India's education system is very, very inferior, and I'm using India because it's 75%, not because I don't like Indian people, obviously. Kash Patel's one of my favorite people, for instance. But in terms of migration, let's just go back to the simple question. Is mass immigration the solution for our problem in America or perceived problem in America of population? And if our problem is, or if our goal is really just to bring in the 0.1% of the geniuses and the entrepreneurial Einsteins, then we wouldn't do it through mass migration. And it's sort of like, let's bring in 1 million and see if we can find those 2 Einsteins in it. We would be very selective and look for the Einsteins, which they obviously do, and bring them in, Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a question which democratic societies settle through debate and coming to consensus, through debate, compromise, and consensus. And so my guess is that there are a whole range of arguments and preferences that American voters have about this. But pretty much everybody will agree that illegal immigration should not be occurring in the United States. Certainly, maybe there's some degree of it that's impossible to prevent, but that it's not something that should be tolerable.
No.
And then is, what do we want? How many new Americans do we want? What sorts of backgrounds do we want them to have? What sort of talent do we want them to have? What sorts of education do we want them to have? Do we want them to be the relatives of people who are already here? I mean, all of these are questions that people can. I don't think that there is a single perfect answer to this stuff, but that's why you have the process.
Right. All right. Well, in your assessment of the world, kind of bringing this all together, do you see a Mad Max dystopian future because we're having this so-called demographic or population collapse? Or do you think it'll stabilize in the future and that, we'll be able to stiffen our upper lip and carry on and have prosperity moving forward? And does AI come into this and new technologies where we don't need to have as big a so-called workforce in order to achieve even greater things than we have in the past?
Well, we can never say that there isn't going to be a Mad Max moment, because human beings have the ability to F it up, right? But it's
What about the zombie
it, it,
apocalypse? Do we-
it takes something. It would take some pretty terrible, pretty broad, and pretty stubborn miscalculations for us to get to that sort of self-inflicted sort of
But
disaster.
the population is not the cause there. It's, in other words,
Yeah,
nuclear war annihilation you're talking about in that
I
circumstance.
mean, I, the um, we'll be getting into science fiction pretty soon, I think, and so maybe the science fiction writers will tell us more than the experts,
Uh-huh.
so-called, can tell us about, stretching our imagination for this new world we're going into. What I would see as the kind of the um, bigger worry, is this paradox between, we've never had more people in the world than we have now, and there's so much loneliness. I mean, there's some
Yeah.
I think we've got the formula for solving material scarcity. We don't have the a formula for solving loneliness. I mean, we don't find that in the in the coding. We find that in some of the great books and our great spiritual tradition. That's where the meaning comes from. But in a world where people have fewer children, more atomized families,
Yeah.
that's what's driving this. Um, we're going to need an answer that money can't give us for solving that part of our
It's
needs.
not on a spreadsheet. It's really
Um,
it's in the soul, it's in the heart, and it's
uh,
about relationships and people. Maybe this is a okay, this is not science fiction. This is just me extrapolating on what's in my brain, but um maybe this is the world population saying, we're all really lonely. We all really think that that there's some work to be done here to improve things in a spiritual and in a, like we said, flourishing human society. And so let's just pause that big old, rush to a trillion population or whatever, and let's just look around and examine and maybe just rethink our priorities and get caught up, take a rest, take a break.
well, it would be a good time to take a measure, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I like that. Well, I am really have enjoyed having this conversation with you,
Likewise.
Nicholas
Yeah.
Eberstadt. And I've, by the way, the books that you mentioned, I just bought one of them because it looked absolutely fascinating. Could we close with you talking about that book that you just mentioned or the one before or both? Would you tell us a
Sure.
little bit about that?
Sure. I about 10 years ago, I just kind of stumbled onto some. A lot of what I do is kind of like find things that are hiding in plain sight, right?
Mhm.
Well, this was the paradox. This is back during the Obama era, when I was listening to this happy talk about how we were at full employment or near full employment. And at the same time, public opinion polls were saying that half of the population thought we were in a recession. I said, how do you make sense of that? And so I started pulling on the thread and taking a look at some of the numbers, and I said, "Holy cow! Uh, they're about almost 10% of the prime age guys are neither working nor looking for work, and this means that the actual work rate for the group is kind of like in late depression levels." And so I was trying to think, how can it be that we have such a large share of